I have titled today's message, The Disruptive Peace of Advent, inspired by an article of the same name by Peter White on the webpage The Sabbath Life. He writes this: In the weeks of Advent that prepare our hearts and minds for Christmas, the story of the infinite God compressed in time and space and flesh and bone in order to save the world. We light candles reminding us of God's hope, God's peace, God's joy, and God's love. Amidst the wistful sentimentality, the vapid commercialism, the shallow nostalgia that the world around us seemed to wallow in, God's people anchor themselves in these four pillars. These four themes are the foundation of our Christmas story, our Christmas counter story. In the second week of Advent, we light a candle for God's peace, the kind of peace that puts the world back together again. Today's scripture passage from Isaiah 11 is one of the most hopeful and beautiful and familiar prophecies in the Bible. It paints a beautiful picture of peace for us, where predators and prey lie down together, where little children lead us in their pure vision of love, and all is right in the world. Those beautiful images have sustained God's people for 2,500 years through trial and tragedy and vindication and victory. But to the people for whom it was originally written, it promised that all was not lost and that God's peaceful kingdom would yet come. For the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about God's people in exile in Babylon. And that really was just the finishing stroke of a long and terrible time. The first chapter of a very long exile and an unraveling of a nation happened a generation earlier when the Assyrian army swept through and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, but left the southern kingdom of Judah and its city of Jerusalem unscathed. The Assyrians would in time be defeated by the Babylonians, and it was then that the Babylonians would come back and finish the job. The words of Isaiah today promise those people of the north that they will survive, that God could use even the aggression of the Assyrians to God's own will and purpose. Maybe you remember making a Jesse tree in Advent in years past. This activity gave a visual description to Jesus' family tree, going all the way back to Jesse, the father of King David. More recent versions include symbols for events in the entire biblical story from creation to the birth of the Christ child. And that continuity of God's promise came to be absolutely central to the Christian church. But for God's people in exile, it must have seemed like the family tree had been felled by the mighty Assyrian axe. Chopped down, cut off, hauled away to be thrown into the fire. The royal family tree of King David seemed to be completely destroyed. But, Isaiah insists, from that chopped off old stump of Jesse will come something new, some new growth, some regrowth. This is something that is unlikely, but not entirely uncommon in nature. there can be new growth right out of something old, or something that even looks to be completely destroyed can still produce a good harvest. We had a Bartlett pear tree that had been toppled in a storm many years before, and the entire trunk was lying on the ground with only a few strands of that trunk actually still connecting it to the part of the tree that was still rooted. Yet every spring, that felled tree produced lush and beautiful blossoms. And every fall, there would be a crop of perfect pears from that broken orchard of one. And that tree to me was a living metaphor for resilience. Isaiah's message to Israel was that in God's garden of grace, even a broken tree can bear fruit. Oh, wow. I'm going to say that again. In God's garden of grace, even a broken tree can bear fruit. Can you say in your heart a little amen to that? Isaiah was right. It was a long time coming, but eventually, the people of Israel and Judah got to come home from exile. Many returned and built a new life, and then worked really hard to live as a chastened people, people who had asked God for a clean slate and had been blessed with a brand new start. So the first part of Isaiah's prophecy here came true, though not particularly during his lifetime. Now, a standard answer to the question of whether a prophet was trustworthy or not was basically take a look at what I've prophesied, and then you can tell me if you think that I'm worth believing in. Although most everyone who originally heard it would want Isaiah's glowing prophecy to be true, they also likely thought that he was a bit of a fool. And it put me in mind, actually, of John Lennon's song, Imagine, that gives us another glimpse into the peaceable kingdom. Lennon wrote, "Imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one." That other part of the prophecy